Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a bit of a microscopic journey. We're going to dive deep into the human eye to explore what is arguably the most highly specialized neural tissue in your entire body, the macula and the fovea. Seriously, this is the biological engine that literally powers your ability to see the world in high definition. I mean, think about it for a second. How are you actually reading these words right now? How do you instantly recognize the face of a friend or appreciate the vivid colors of a sunset? Well, it's actually not your whole eye doing the heavy lifting for those really detailed tasks. The specific tissue you're using to focus right now is the tiny, hyper-specialized region we're exploring today. So here's our game plan for today. We'll start with the center of vision, then step inside the fovea, check out the yellow shield, and finally wrap up with macular diseases. Let's get right into it. Starting off with section 1, the center of vision. Think of your retina kind of like a high-end camera sensor. But within that sensor, we are looking for the absolute highest definition focal point. That is the macula. It sits just temporal to the optic disc, and guys, it is tiny, only about 5 to 6 millimeters across. Yet this incredibly small area is solely responsible for our most detailed visual tasks. To actually pull this off, it requires an immense amount of metabolic support and an environment with almost zero light scatter. It builds this perfect visual bullseye. You start at the outer edge with the macula lutea, step inward to the perifovea, and then the parafovea. As you keep zooming in, you hit the fovea, which is a mere 1.5 millimeters across. And finally, right in the middle, you reach the absolute center, the foveola. This tiny little bullseye is the absolute peak of human visual resolution. Moving right along to section 2, inside the foveas. Now, what's really wild here is how the physical shape of the fovea actually dictates how it works. It forms this distinct little depression known as the foveal pit. To give light a perfectly clear path, the inner retinal layers literally push themselves out of the way. The tissue here is physically thinner, and there are absolutely no overlying ganglion cells blocking the center. This means incident light can hit the photoreceptors directly with almost zero scattering. And this brings us to a dramatic difference in the eye's neural wiring. Out in your peripheral retina, you've got multiple photoreceptors clumping together and converging onto a single ganglion cell. Now that's highly efficient for catching a blur of motion in the corner of your eye, but it's terrible for fine detail. But in the fovea, there is a near one-to-one relationship between the cone photoreceptors, bipolar cells, and ganglion cells. That exact lack of convergence is precisely what gives you such sharp visual acuity. Zooming in on the cellular hardware, the fovea is just packed with an extremely high density of tight, narrow cone photoreceptors. But get this, there is an absolute absence of rod photoreceptors right in the central foveola. Because rods are what govern our night vision, our absolute central vision is actually kind of blind in pitch darkness. Have you ever noticed that a really dim star might disappear when you look right at it, but pops back up when you look just slightly away? That's exactly why. Plus, you have these specialized Macular cells providing structural support, acting almost like biological fiber optics to channel the light perfectly. Now, for this area to be optically flawless, it literally has to clear out the plumbing. So the very center of the fovea features what we call an avascular zone. It is completely void of retinal capillaries, which prevents blood vessels from casting microscopic shadows over your vision. But there's a huge trade-off here. Without its own capillaries, this highly active tissue becomes entirely dependent on the underlying choroidal circulation for all of its oxygen and nutrients. Which brings us nicely to section 3, the yellow shield. You know, all that heavy lifting, reading, seeing colors, picking out tiny details, creates a massive amount of oxidative stress. To protect against this, the macula actually has its own built-in biochemical sunglasses. This specialized pigment is what gives the macula lutea its yellow appearance. This internal yellow shield is made up primarily of the carotenoid pigments lutein and zeaxanthin, which are heavily concentrated right within the inner retinal layers. So what is this shield actually doing for us? Well, primarily it absorbs short-wavelength blue light and neutralizes reactive oxygen species, which, let's be real, is incredibly relevant today with the sheer amount of time we spend staring at screens. Blue light carries high energy that can cause oxidative retinal injury over time. By filtering this light and acting as a powerful antioxidant, this pigment reduces light scatter, improves contrast, and protects your delicate tissue. It becomes absolutely vital as we age. All right, let's look at section 4, macular diseases. Because the macula is so insanely specialized, it's also uniquely vulnerable. The biggest and most common of these vulnerabilities is age-related macular degeneration, or AMD. AMD is a leading cause of central visual loss. It involves deep pathological changes within the retinal pigment epithelium, Bruch's membrane, and the choroidal capillaris. When damage happens here, patients suffer from distorted vision and have intense difficulty reading or recognizing faces. And here's the crazy part: even if their peripheral vision remains perfectly fine. One of the very first physical clues that this system is struggling is the buildup of something called drusen. These are essentially extracellular deposits that get stuck between the retinal pigment epithelium and Bruch's membrane. Drusen act as a major clinical hallmark of AMD, physically showing us that the critical metabolic exchange within the outer retina is impaired due to aging. Once that process starts, AMD usually heads down one of two really tough paths. First, there's dry AMD, also known as geographic atrophy. This is a slow cellular loss where the retinal pigment epithelial cells degenerate and the photoreceptors basically just die off. Then you have wet or neovascular AMD. This one is a rapid, highly destructive process where abnormal blood vessels physically grow beneath the retina, causing fluid leakage, hemorrhage, and scarring that can very quickly destroy the entire macular architecture. But it's not just AMD. This region is so delicate that other things can throw it completely off balance. Take macular edema, for instance, where fluid builds up due to diabetic retinopathy or inflammation. Then there's a macular hole, which is literally a full-thickness defect in the fovea, often caused by an aging vitreous physically pulling on the tissue. Or central serous chorioretinopathy, where fluid actually elevates the macula. Because the fovea is so highly organized, even a microscopic amount of fluid or a tiny bit of structural pulling can completely ruin someone's visual acuity. We also have to factor in genetics, because inherited macular diseases are very much a reality here. Disorders like Stargardt disease or various cone and pattern dystrophies can deeply disrupt this region. From a very early age, these disorders trigger abnormal metabolism within the photoreceptors or the retinal pigment epithelium, proving just how incredibly delicate the metabolic balance of the macula truly is. So that leaves us with a pretty massive question to ponder. We've just seen how incredibly precise, delicate, and absolutely vital the macula and fovea are to human life. But with modern research moving at lightning speed, advancing stem cell treatments, gene therapy, neuroprotection, and even retinal prostheses, could we one day entirely rebuild a damaged macula? Understanding normal macular physiology is the very first step toward those future therapies. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope you walk away today with a brand new appreciation for the microscopic engine currently working tirelessly in your eyes, allowing you to see the world.